True or false? Teachers should be trying to do themselves out of a job. If we as teachers are charged with the duty to create individuals who are self-reliant, then we must set goals for independence. This session is on the topic of self-management. How did self-management become known as an effective practice? It started with an intervention to help people stop smoking. To collect baseline data, the researchers asked individuals to count the number of cigarettes they smoked each day. Through that process, individuals collected their own data and submitted to the researchers. What the researchers found was that people in the study gradually decreased the number of cigarettes smoked each day during baseline condition without any intervention. This brought to the attention that simply being aware of your own behavior and monitoring it can make you change it. Students must learn to manage themselves at some point within a systematic instruction program. Self-management is the personal application of behavior change tactics that produce a desired change in behavior. Here we see a continuum of self-management. On the left side, we have external agent control and feedback. External consequence administration. The teacher, most likely, is in charge and control of the student and the student behavior. But as students become more independent and learn to self-manage, they begin to evaluate their own behavior against the criteria, and they can administer their own consequences, which have become internalized. What are the advantages of self-management systems? Teachers cannot always be aware of the behavior responses that are part of a behavior change intervention. We rely on the students to observe their own thinking and behaving. Self-management does extend the generality of behavior change because the control is put into the student's hand, and it follows the student to all settings. This allows general education teachers more time to teach while the student self-manages and self-reinforces his or her own behavior. In general ed settings, we have typical reward systems, but students with disabilities may not be controlled by those what are considered weak outcomes because it takes a great deal of work and concentration to be able to maintain the expectations in a gen ed classroom. So increased independence is the goal of education, and self-management can lead us there. Gen ed teachers report high acceptability of self-management procedures, preferring student monitoring to teacher monitoring because it frees their time up for instructional and related activities. Lee, Simpson, and Schrogen, 2007, reported that self-management procedures had an empowering effect on the student's ability to control their own behavior. They believe that self-management procedures will facilitate inclusion in the general curriculum as well as increasing student determination, which eventually would improve quality of life. Here you have the 3 considerations when developing a self-management program. When should we use self-management? Perhaps when the child is not accomplishing what he or she wants to accomplish, and they desire to make the change. The child has a clear picture of the change that he or she wants to make. The child is also physically and mentally capable of engaging in the desired new behavior. The child is able to anticipate the benefits of the behavior change and is compelled to attain that. And the child typically responds favorably to teacher reminders. King, Sears, and Carpenter have produced a mnemonic which describes the self-management framework design and implementation phases. The mnemonic is SPIN. S, select the behavior for self-management. Here, you must identify and define behavior to be changed, determine the mastery criteria, and measure the current performance levels of the behavior. That would be called baseline data. P, prepare to teach the self-management system. First, you must determine the type of self-management system and develop that management system. Perhaps your self-management system has the student self-monitor or self-observe. The student must be able to differentiate when he or she is engaging in the correct behavior or not. Perhaps the system has the student self-record. You must determine your recording sheet and the procedures for that. The student might self-graph. You'll have to set up the materials for the student to do the graphing and, of course, the instruction on how to do that. Perhaps the student will self-evaluate. So we'll consider, did my performance increase from yesterday or not? And with that, the student can self-reinforce, either asking him or herself, did I meet my goal? Or am I improving beyond yesterday? If so, hey, I'm going to give myself a pat on the back. Am I not improving? Well, I'm going to tell myself, you'll try harder tomorrow. Remember the strategy you've been taught, or remember the new skill you've been taught. I, instruct the student about self-management system using the 10-step instructional sequence. The 10-step instructional sequence is broken down into introduce the target behavior, introduce the management system, and provide practice and assess the mastery. And finally, we have N. Note short-term and long-term effects on student performance. So just like you collected the baseline data or the current performance, we must also assess short-term performance of the behavior and the long-term maintenance of the self-management system. So continuing to take the data is important to note changes. And we also need to promote generalization of the self-management system by having the student use the system in other environments, in other situations. King, Sears, and Carpenter also provide an assessment checklist for student mastery of self-management. So while you're teaching the student, given the 10-step implementation process, you will want to assess the student for mastery. And here are the questions that you're seeking an affirmative for in order to move on with your self-management. So in your King, Sears, and Carpenter manual, 1997, you have much more detail and options for considering as you learn to implement a quality self-management program. Do note, you're required to set up a self-management program within your Part 3 of the PBS project. But you're probably thinking about that data we just mentioned. How do students self-record data, and how do I monitor data? It can be the same data collection that you ask the child to do for self-monitoring and self-evaluation and self-recording, or it could be different. But your options are really the same as any data collection method you would use to determine if behavior change is occurring in the classroom. You know about event recording, sometimes also called frequency, where you simply count the number of behaviors that have occurred. And this would be a good data collection method if you're trying to record events that have a discrete beginning and end, making it easy to count. And the duration of each event is very similar. If you need to estimate frequency because it's difficult to count, or estimate duration because it's difficult to see the beginning or the end, you will use some sort of time sampling method. Interval recording is another way we use that. Whole interval, partial interval, or momentary time sampling, where we have divided our observation section into smaller time sessions, and whether the behavior occurs during the interval or not is how we determine the occurrence of the behavior. And then permanent product recording can also be a worksheet, a spelling test, a written assignment, anything that we have a permanent product of that we're going to be evaluating and counting. So it's easy to choose one of these methods based on the type of behavior you're trying to collect data on. Okay, so now I want to talk about some different ways self-management has been researched in the past. Some researchers have looked at self-management of appropriate class behavior. So this would be more behavioral and non-academic problems that are addressed. One researcher, Shabani, used self-management with students with a non-resetting DRO, meaning they set a timer for 10 seconds, which eventually increased to 5 minutes. And if the student did not rock in chair or while standing during that time frame of the timer, the student would be able to mark a plus in the datasheet box and immediately access Reinforcer. Rocking behaviors did decrease, and the student was able to go much more extended amount of time with the system and without receiving reinforcement. Within the self-monitoring paradigm, students typically ask, did I do it? For example, having all materials needed, completing homework, following instructions, staying on task, and completing classroom assignments. Sometimes students self-record with a Likert scale. How well did I do? May rate themselves on a scale from 0 to 5. It is important the teacher and the student train in matching so that we have some reliability in data collection. Here's another example of recording materials. There's a list of items the students expected to do, and they give themselves points for how well they perceived their performance. Sometimes students are expected to self-reinforce. They ask themselves, have I earned my reward? In the example of the Shabatini article, the student waited for the timer and determined if he or she had rocked during that time. She ultimately did get the time of the DRO up to 5 minutes, but then was able to self-reinforce and access reinforcement once the timer went off. Sometimes you might also have students matching the teacher's data. So if you're collecting 3 opportunities to self-record, if all 3 match, they might earn bonus points. Here's an example of data when a teacher was using self-management and self-reinforcement and then used matching to get bonus tokens. And you can see the ratings and the performance increased when the student knew there was accountability. Self-management has also been used to increase student social skills. For example, in the Lofton article, social initiation and social interaction were taught to a student with autism. Social initiation was defined as starting an interaction with a peer with whom there has not been an interaction during the previous 5 seconds. That's social initiation. Social interaction was defined as any verbal or gestural behavior directed toward the child within 5 seconds after the initiation. The teacher took a 5-minute sample of interactions and also recorded stereotypic behavior. This was done in the lunchroom. 10-second partial interval with a 10-second recording time. The child, on the other hand, collected data on a wrist golf counter, and each time she initiated or interacted with another student in the cafeteria, she pressed the button on the golf wrist counter, and when the number 2 showed up, for example, if that was the goal for the day, she would go to the teacher and ask for the reinforcer. On-task behavior has also been a good behavior to use self-management. When the students observe, did I do it? Was I paying attention to my assigned work? And was I following the class rules? Students might be alerted by a tone or a vibrating device called a motivator. Or smartphones and tablets often have timers on them that are relatively individualized. Then there is an overt recording check sheet, and students in the Wilkerson article had 5-minute intervals at first, but it was faded to 20 minutes once they met a previous criterion. And they asked themselves, did I earn my reward at the end of the 5 intervals? And it was compared against a preset goal. Here is the sample sheet. Another option, perhaps a bit more mature, has a goal for the student, asking how well am I working, and the student marks a plus each time he hears the tone and finds himself working well. Marks a minus if he hears the tone and is not working well. So let me ask you, what type of data collection is this? It is momentary time sampling, because it's not until you hear the tone do you consider, am I engaging in the behavior? Here's a result for Allen, who used the original 5-interval data collection sheet. You can see the overall teacher ratings of the student behavior increased while he was self-managing. The student did use external cueing with a timer. Problems with that can be it distracts thinking. It could distract from the task. So you could also ask a student to simply record anytime they think about the data collection. However, we have to think about if monitoring on-task behavior is going to produce changes in accuracy. Self-management has been done specifically on self-managing productivity and accuracy. In this case, Mag et al. In 1993 had 3 target variables measured: percentage of on-task behavior, academic productivity, which was the number of math problems completed, and academic accuracy, percentage of math problems completed correctly. Based on the criteria developed by Lloyd in 1989, on-task behavior was defined along 2 dimensions. A, the student's use of their hands, manipulating a pen or a pencil, raising their hand, counting on their fingers, and B, where the student's eyes were directed, looking at assigned work, the teachers, or peers. So this was a very clear, observable, and measurable definition. The occurrences of on-task behavior was noted when the students were looking at the independent practice math sheets, holding on or writing with a pencil, or making erasures. For productivity, the students simply counted the math problems at certain time intervals, and for accuracy, the student was given a key and checked for accuracy at certain intervals. The system was faded as researchers informed students that the tone would no longer occur, but they were to use self-management of choice whenever it occurred for them to do so. Here are the results of the study. Self-monitoring different target behaviors does not appear to differentially affect on-task behavior. So self-monitoring of the productivity and accuracy did not impact on-task behavior. However, self-monitoring different target variables did differentially affect the productivity and accuracy. Self-monitoring academic outcomes is more effective than self-monitoring attention for academic productivity and accuracy for that reason. And the students preferred to monitor academic outcomes. This is a self-management data collection sheet for a writing intervention. So the students were learning a strategy called SPACE for writing stories that had 5 parts to make a complete story. And each time the student wrote a story, they would read it over again to determine if they had all the parts of the story. Self-help skills have also been taught using self-management. In the Pearson-Schreiberman 1994 article, the students were given a picture book of real pictures of each step in a task analysis for certain tasks, such as setting the table, getting dressed, or making lunch and doing laundry. The student turned the page in the picture book after observing the step complete. And at the end was a smiley face. So the student at the end was asked, "Did you complete the task analysis?" And the student would say, "Yes, I reached the end, I reached the smiley face," and collect the reinforcer. Here's an example of the data. On-task behavior before, and given the picture, task analysis, high levels of on-task behavior and low levels of inappropriate behavior across 3 behaviors. So this was a successful attempt to use self-management to increase self-help skills. Self-management has also been used to support vocational skills. The student observes if he or she completed a task. When the task was completed, the student put a token in the jar, and when the number of tokens identified as the goal were in the jar, they could be exchanged for reinforcer, gradually increasing the goal. Additionally, students can self-instruct. It's suggested that you use STAR, Stop, Think, Act, and Result. That is by Morris in 1980. A target behavior to focus on for the day, a covert direction to say to himself as a self-control cue, a specific appropriate behavior to practice, and a personal card printed for use at the work site. A grid at the bottom of the card instructed the student to mark a plus for yes and minus for no whenever he periodically was cued to self-monitor the behavior. Additionally, with self-instruct, if you feel yourself reaching a high level of stress or anxiety, there are ways to remind yourself to calm down. You might say, "Breathe through your nose." Or tell yourself, "Wow, Dr. Clinton will sure be proud of me." Or, "The early bird gets the worm. Let's get started with work sooner." Or, if it's the social skill, the student might say to himself, "Look for clues," and work toward the social strategy that has been taught. Or if it's feeling tired and lagging in work, to tell yourself, "Full throttle," and that helps this person invest in work. Whatever works for you. The motivator is a great way to cue yourself to self-instruct. It vibrates at a set tone, and so it's not disruptive to others, but it allows you to remind yourself to give yourself whatever strategy you have determined. Although a degree of control and responsibility is given to children and adolescents involved in self-management, generally they are typically still subject to some adult regulation. Most self-management programs, for example, are designed by adults. Adults provide the training, and adults monitor the children and the performance. Kern et al. In 1997 attempted to increase the independence of adolescents by teaching them to self-initiate their implementation across settings and activities. They were taught to self-monitor appropriate and inappropriate vocalizations, use a timer, and independently initiate the procedure. Across 2 students, one independently initiated 40% of the time, and the other initiated 95% of the time. But at the end of the day, habilitation is key. You want students to use this system immediately after learning a new skill so they can capitalize on familiarity and promote carryover. We want them to teach them skills in situations where the intended action is most relevant. So, for example, when David was using a self-token economy to improve his sitting posture, his teacher had him use the system only during the portion of the day when children were expected to remain in their seats. And you want them to use the situation where taking the intended action is most likely to produce rewarding results for the child, where the payoff is the greatest. Example, when Sarah used self-management to stay on task, her teacher asked her to use a device during those classroom activities where she felt there were the clearest and most favorable relationships between attending to work and getting more of the playtime she wanted. You want to use it in situations where teachers, parents, and other children are most apt to notice and react in reinforcing ways to the intended behavioral improvement. For example, when Scott used the motivator to control his stuttering, his speech clinician had him use a device in a class where he felt the teacher would be most visibly excited about his newfound fluency. And when Kristen used self-management to quit sucking her thumb, her teacher sent the materials home so parents could see and reinforce her project progress. So the term habilitation is the degree to which a person's repertoire maximizes short and long-term reinforcers for that individual and for others, and minimizes short and long-term punishers. In other words, we want immediacy, relevancy, and payoff. And that is going to give us positive reactions. So I encourage you to invest in self-management, but remember, always with fidelity. Thanks, and have a great day.